Hi! Today I am here to give you a spoiler-free review of The Buried Giant by Kazuo Ishiguro. So hopefully by now you know how this works. Before I actually talk about my review of the different aspects of the book, I'll give you a brief synopsis. So The Buried Giant is set in England not long after Arthurian times, kind of in the English Dark Ages. So it's not long after King Arthur ruled over England. We're living in a time where a lot of those fantasy legends supposedly still exist. Ogres and dragons and all of those things are still roaming around England at the time. The most important thing about this particular England that the book is set in is that there's a sickness going around that they're calling the mist, which basically stops people from being able to remember the past. For the most part, as soon as something is in the past, even half an hour in the past, you can't remember clearly what happened. And the story centers around an old couple. Their names are Axel and Beatrice, and they live in a village in this England, and they decide to go on a journey in search of their son, who they have very little memory of. They can't remember where he lives or what he looks like, and they can't even remember the last time they saw him, but they're basically holding on to this memory that they have a son out there somewhere, and they're going to search to try and find him. So first up, let's talk about the setting in this book. The setting was very beautiful and very incredibly poetic and almost like a fable. Like I said, it's set in England and it's supposedly actually our England. Like, it's not an alternate universe, it's not like a fantasy version of England. It is our England, and it's operating under the assumption that we've just gone back in time to this England when all these fantasy elements still exist. And the way that Kazuo Ishiguro writes about these elements and how they fit into the universe and how they've always been there is really cleverly done and really poetically done. It feels nostalgic more than anything else. It doesn't feel like a fantasy novel, it feels like a novel of nostalgia. So the setting, as I said, is very much kind of like a fable. If you've watched my review of The Hobbit, or if you've watched my review of The Book of Dust, you will know that this is a kind of setting that I really love. I particularly have always been obsessed with fantasy England. So it was really lovely for me, and I really enjoyed reading this book that was set in this England that is so real feeling, even though there are dragons and ogres wandering around. And because of that, I would give the setting in this book a 5-star rating. Next up, let's talk about the plot. The plot is very much an adventure novel. In fact, it's very similar to The Hobbit. So you have this elderly couple and they're going on this journey, and all you're doing is just following them go on this journey. And it's very slow and steady paced because they're just walking across the land and encountering things at the pace that they can walk across the land, and they're very slow moving. They come across ogres and they come across pixies. There's even a dragon involved. Like, it's very similar to The Hobbit in this sense of just an epic journey. I think the main thing that I would point out in particular for someone who is interested in reading this book and doesn't know much about it is that it's very slow and steadily paced. Like, there are obstacles that happen that they have to overcome, and there definitely are events that happen in the story, but everything happens quite slowly, and everything is written with this poetry that means that it feels more like a bedtime story than an action-packed adventure story. It was very beautiful to read, so I would give the plot here a 5-star rating as well. Next up, let's talk about the characters. The main characters obviously are the elderly couple Axel and Beatrice, and if you read this book, I guarantee that they will become your relationship goals. They are the absolute sweetest couple and the most heartwarming couple to read about as they do what they do. The way that they interact with each other, even the way that they walk together through this country, is just beautiful and romantic, but not in like a whirlwind Romeo and Juliet kind of romance, but in a steady, lifelong kind of romance. And even without their memories of each other and their past, they still are just steadfast and dedicated to each other and absolutely in love with each other. There are some other characters that you come across as well. The interesting thing about all of them is that they all have a lot of depth to them, and this was one of my favorite things about the book, because I've said a few times that it felt like The Hobbit, but I think the most important thing about it is that it's like The Hobbit but more nuanced, and everyone has flaws to them and good parts to them, and no one is really the villain. Even the kind of the bad guys as such are sympathetic, and it was really lovely to read about these characters and to almost be sympathetic with characters and the reasons why they ended up doing things that are actually quite damaging to the people around them. So because of that, I would also give the characters a 5-star rating. Obviously fast becoming clear that this is a book that I really loved. So I will talk very briefly about the themes, and the reason why I'm only going to talk briefly about them is because I haven't done much reading on the themes. I can only talk about them as I've like come across them throughout the book. So obviously one of the major themes in this book is the concept of memory, and in particular like the balance of pro and con that comes from remembering things, particularly if it's something that is a bad memory. And so this is all very well interspersed throughout the story because you get characters who have dialogues because they have very different memories of what has happened. And you get characters who have dialogues about whether or not they really want to remember or whether they would rather stay forgetting. And you have characters who talk about how real their relationship can be if they can't remember what's happened to them in the past. So you get this kind of concept of how can we really know the nature of our relationship when we can't remember the events that have happened in our relationship in the past. So basically all of these characters and these interactions and the events that everyone goes through throughout this story all work together to paint a different picture of a different facet of that concept of memory. And it's really clever, and it is very much multifaceted, and you, even upon finishing the book, you're not really sure what side you're for in terms of like forgetting or remembering, because you can see that there are different sides to it and there are different situations that will cause you to want to remember or to want to forget. And I thought that that was really clever, and I can't wait to read more about it. It will come as no surprise then that I gave the themes in this book also a 5-star rating, which leads to this book having a 5-star rating overall. I finished this book only a couple of days ago, and obviously I'm still not okay. Even a couple of days after having finished it, I'm still in this kind of whirlwind of how do I feel about this book, and how do I feel about what happened in this book, and how do I feel about the things that were said in this book. For that reason, I think it is a book that I would very much recommend to a lot of people, and I don't want to say too much more without actually accidentally spoiling things, but it is a book that will definitely stay with you if you can end up reading it. I'm gonna sign off now because I've rambled about this book for 20 minutes now. I will see you in some other video very shortly, possibly even a spoilery discussion of this book, because I have a lot of feels that I want to talk about. Until then, as always, stay classic.
Sit there and count your fingers.